Are you clear on how your podcast fits into your larger service offerings? Does the idea of your podcast being one of your services even make sense? I want you to stay with me because I want you to listen to this episode. I've got an incredible woman, an incredible mind joining me, Shannon Baker, and we're going to be talking about how she started thinking about her podcast as a larger part of her offerings and the changes it created for her and for her show. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. Welcome. I'm super stoked because we have a rare treat today. I brought a friend to talk to you. Shannon Baker, who is a client of mine, a longtime listener of this show, worked with me recently in a podcast strategy intensive, and then went and kicked butt on the implementation. I'm so impressed with what she was able to create and what we were able to do on the call. I wanted to bring her on and I wanted to talk about what it was we did and what it looked like. In the course of our conversation, I'm going to highlight a couple of things for you. But what I want to highlight for you before we get started is that she really took this and implemented immediately. This wasn't something she let sit. This was something she started taking action on right away, even though we built a Q1 strategy for her in, I think we did it in like early October. Might have even been, no, it was definitely October. It was an incredible call. I really enjoyed our time together. And I think you're going to get some really good insights around some of the levers she pulled to be able to implement when she had a lot going on. She was trying to decide a lot of things, and she kind of decided to launch a lot of things all at once. And it worked out because she took the time to figure out how they fit together. I do want you to know I have podcast strategy intensives available right now for January and February. If that is something you would like to get a hold of, your Q1 strategy, if you would like to get some clarity around what you want to be doing with your podcast this year, these podcast strategy intensives are the way to do it. You can learn more at uncommonlymore.com/intensive. With that, let's get into our call with systems genius, Shannon Baker. All right, I am joined now by Shannon, and I am really excited, but I'm going to just jump right into this conversation with you because I know we have so much to share. So before we get too far sort of down the road, I want you to loop everyone listening in on who you are and what you do, because it's really freaking cool and they need to pay attention.
So, Shannon Baker. And my company actually is the Shannon Baker. I'm definitely a personal brand, which is why I use my name. It's unique to me. So, with that being said, I started off as a virtual assistant, which is something that Stacey and I have in common. But over the years in working with clients, as I reached burnout, I realized it was because they were dictating my services to me. And frankly, I hated what I was doing because they didn't have processes in place. So once I identified that that was the issue in the working relationship and no one was helping them to fix that gap, I decided to shift my business and start to fill that gap with my services. So now I specifically work with solopreneurs and small business owners. Even if you operate as a team of one, we all need systems. So that's more than just the automation. It's a full, I call it holistic, and that's whole, WHOLE, because it's a big picture other than just the processes that play into getting your systems in place. So that's what I help my clients with my signature process, which gives them the power to create success on their own terms.
I love that. And I just want to highlight one thing, which is if you are someone who is a company of one, I would argue that systems are even more important because you are using systems instead of people. You will spend money one way or the other. And personally, the money spent when we invest in bringing in consultants or experts or even coaches, even in joining a mastermind, like any investments we make in ourselves and our business, really the ROI gets expanded, I'll say, when we have systems in place to integrate those lessons and do things with it. And that's a big conversation we're going to have, because you are one of my favorite humans, because you are an all-out implementer. You are so good about taking whatever value, wherever you consume it, and like doing stuff with it. And I'm so excited to have you on the show to talk, because you and I have sort of hung out for a long time. And recently, in the fall of last year, because it's January now, holy moly. In the fall of last year, you and I sat down for a podcast strategy intensive. And we did some really cool work. But I want us to talk about what was going on for you before that and why this was the right time. Because you and I had worked together before in a single session. And so walk me through our time together, how you found me, because you're somebody who takes action from the podcast, which is one of the reasons I adore you so much, is you listen to the show and do stuff. And so let's give a rundown of our timeline together, because I also think this is really valuable to understand where your listeners are coming from, because oftentimes we get in this hoop of like, somebody will listen to this one episode and then they'll buy, which is not really how life works at all. How long have you been listening to the show for?
Since it was hit the mic and you had the pink hair. We have been connected that long.
Yeah, which is more than 5 years. Yeah. So it takes time. But what I think is really cool is I still knew you were out there. I still knew you exist, because we would have conversations. You're really good about DMing and we talk a lot, and I love that. When it came time to take it a step further than the podcast, what were some of the indicators for you that it was time for you and I to sit down actually one-on-one and not just in your car?
So because we had that car time together over the years, and actually our relationship started on Facebook, and then once Instagram came about, we connected there and our relationship grew. But I had been putting off starting a podcast for years. So I had gotten bits and pieces of how to do it from you. So that helped me get started. And you personally helped me through those conversations in the DMs. So that filled in the gaps that were missing from the course that I took to start my podcast. So I did that for 2 years, which I actually launched in March 2020, right before the world changed and shut down because of COVID.
Yeah. Interesting launch time, I bet.
It was very interesting. And I was really scared about it, because I was like, oh my gosh, everybody's stuck at home. No one's going to be listening now because no one's driving in their car. Everyone's at home. But I said, well, you know what? I'm doing this anyway, and we're just going to see what happens with it. And I only had 35. I'll take that back. I won't say only. I launched with 35 consistent people listening to my episodes every week. So
Yay.
That to me was a win that I held on to. Download numbers weren't big, but they were consistent. So for me, that was a success.
I love that. And it's I want to point something out there. You are comparing your numbers to your numbers. And that's something you and I have talked about. It's something I talk a lot about, probably an annoyingly large amount I talk about. The numbers that you have, the only reliable metric you have to compare them to are the numbers you've already had. And this is why I always suggest starting before you think it's perfect, because you are the only one who can collect the data to improve your show. It is really hard to compare it against something else because you're not comparing apples to apples. So I love that you were seeing that win and that consistency, a win a lot of people would have set aside. And that's where we end up with people who have 3 episodes of a podcast or 5 episodes of a podcast and it hasn't been touched in 2 years, which I'm sure there are lots of shows that rolled out with you in March 2020 who did fall prey to that and are no longer podcasting.
They are gone. Yes. So I stayed the course. I made the commitment. One of your podcast episodes, you were like, give it a year. So I was like, okay, I'm committing for a year. I'll see how this goes. And it went well. I gained lots of visibility, got lots of speaking opportunities just from people listening to the podcast. But then I noticed there was no leads coming in from that. So took some time, stuck with it, stayed the course to try to figure out what was going on. So I didn't experience pod fade, which was good, but I knew it wasn't working the way I wanted it to for my business. So I knew I needed to shift the podcast itself and even the way I was running my business. My business model needed to change, my services needed to change, and the podcast needed to support that. So spring of last year, which will be 2022, I was like, okay, you know what? We need to pause this and figure out what's wrong and where I want this to go. So at that point, had a conversation with you, recorded, I think that was the first paid consultation or call we had together.
Yep.
And you helped me work through how to pause it on good terms, but come back to it later. But one thing I appreciate in that call is you told me, set a date to hop back in. Otherwise, I won't. So I did, January 1st. Even though I, came back before then, thanks to the podcast strategy call with you, I came back in December. But that was why I decided, okay, this is outside of my lane of expertise. I know business strategy, but podcast strategy is outside of my expertise, and you are my expert. So I booked the call.
I love that. And what I think is really common is I'm not getting leads, and so I'm going to pause. And I like that you highlighted that we set a return date because it's really, really easy to pause. It is not really, really easy to start again.
Mm-hmm.
It is much easier to stay paused. And that's why we talk about pod fade, because it doesn't tend to be some big dramatic exit where, I'm taking my toys and leave it. Like, it doesn't tend to be that. It tends to be just like the Irish goodbye, and everyone's like, where did they go? And they're like, oh yeah, they're just not here now.
Mm-hmm.
And so setting that return date is really, really critical. So you set that return date, but you mentioned you actually came back a little sooner because in the fall, you and I sat down for a podcast strategy intensive, bigger than our 1 hour little consult we had done initially. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think we did a 30-minute call.
Yep.
Initially.
30-minute. Mm-hmm.
Because from time to time, I like to run those little, come hang out with me for 30 minutes. We booked the podcast strategy intensive. So let's talk about where you were when we booked the podcast strategy intensive, because it's not the only thing you were playing with right then. The podcast was a part of a larger picture. So let's paint that larger picture. Where were you when we sat down for the podcast strategy intensive that helped you sort of show up to that?
Okay. So I made the decision, I think in August, of what I wanted to do in my business, which was launch a membership and rebrand the podcast so that they could feed. Really, my services are now strategically arranged circularly to support each other. And that came out of the podcast strategy intensive call that we had. So the podcast is just one piece of this circle of services that continually help my listeners and my clients continue to grow their business. So crazy me, I signed up for a 6-week intensive to launch a membership. Then I booked the strategy intensive for you. So while it was crazy getting through everything and pulling the pieces together, it was the best way to do it because it came together, because the podcast itself was the moving piece, but that pushed the strategy of launching the membership, and then all my marketing just fell into place, which was a relief because it's always been a thorn in my side. It's not what I do, and I hate content marketing. I know it's required, and I need it, but my business runs really off of referrals, but I'm at a point where I need more than that to actually grow my business. So I had to put on my big girl drawers and just accept that I needed to finally make the investment and create a strategy for everything to work together.
What I love is you take the perspective that I think more podcasters should take, where the podcast sits as a part of your service offering. And I don't think we think enough about the fact that the podcast does need to be of service. And I love that you were looking at these things all together because they do need to feed each other. That's how we build strategic content. That's how we build assets that can do some of the sales lift for us, is we think about these things not in silos separate from each other, but in context of each other. How is one supporting another? One of my favorite things, especially with clients who have memberships, I did this way back in the day when Hit the Mic had a membership component. I would often sort of add additional value to my current clients through the podcast. Still today, we have one on, like, our production clients, the biggest way you can work with us. They're still avid listeners of the podcast. They're still avid listeners of Podcast Newsroom because it allows them to stay in it between our calls. And so as much as my content is set up to help somebody who's never heard of me understand that I know what I'm talking about and I can help them too, it's also built to just be helpful, to just be a part of understanding what we stand for around here, how we operate, how we think about these things. And I love that you really intentionally, especially when you have a membership component where you are teaching them stuff, often through audio and video in some of the same ways they're absorbing content from you, really feeding those things together, because that is what makes that next step really natural. It's like, oh, it's just more of this thing I already like doing with you. And that's sitting and listening to you talk to me in my car or while I walk the dogs or whatever. I love that you're considering that. When you booked the podcast strategy intensive and you got on the call with me, what were your expectations of what that call was going to be?
I knew that when I walked away from that call, I was going to know exactly what steps I needed to take next. That I'll have the plan that I needed, which would kind of be my blueprint for relaunching the podcast, kind of pivoting in the business. I mean, it was critical to everything, just that call. Even to the point that in November, I've been in business for over 10 years, but using that layout helped me to complete all of my content for the month of November. I've never done that. Like, I put it off and I kind of fly by the seat of my pants with it. It works, but I needed room. Now I have room because I have a plan that's based on the podcast. And then once it relaunched, it's okay. Now I also have content from the podcast to add into this rotation, which I was missing. So it was just a relief, which I knew it would be, that it was totally worth the investment.
I love that. I love that you came in knowing what you wanted. And I think that's what was really helpful as we sat down, because before we sat down, I did an audit. I listened to a couple of episodes of the show. I come into the call, just sort of giving everyone a lay of the land here. I come onto that call and I've got a big Google Doc that is basically our play space for the day. We literally just sit in there together and everything we plan out goes into that doc. We're building it during that 2 hours together. And you came so clear on what you wanted out of the call. It was really easy for us to work through getting you the deliverable you needed to go and do that. So inside of that call, is there any sort of like highlights or key takeaways or wins that came out of that time together that you sort of had an immediate relief? Was it having that doc when we were all done? What were some of the wins from just that initial call time together?
Yeah, so the immediate relief definitely was having the plan, in that it included me being able to add in my private podcast, which I'm now using as my lead magnet, and it's going over very well. It's like I knew that that was the element that I wanted to use for lead generation because of hearing about private podcasts from your podcast. But I didn't know how to do it, like how to structure it, how to make it fit in. So when we got to that piece during the call, that definitely helped me to lay that out and again, make all the pieces fit together. One, without, I guess, kind of being redundant with the information, but making sure it all complemented each other.
I love that. One of the reasons you have seen success on the other side of our podcast strategy intensive with getting content batched and getting things done and ready and finding that space is you are a fantastic implementer. And I genuinely deeply believe part of that is your systems brain. And this is why I'm talking about this is how you maximize your ROI, is have an understanding of your system so that you can put this new information into something that's executable. I want to step a little bit outside of just talking about the intensives and talk a little bit about how you went about implementing. Because I handed over a call recording and a document. This, a finished podcast and new private podcast does not make. Like, that takes work on the other side, guys. It's not 2 hours and we're out. 2 hours and I'm done. You now have to really get started. So can you walk us a little bit through, even if it's some of the systems or frameworks or whatever that you have in place for your implementation, how did you go about sort of hitting the ground running and getting that implementation going?
Okay. So at the time of our call, I had already laid out what I wanted to be the episodes. After the call, I basically chucked that and started over from scratch because
always good.
It wasn't going to help me achieve the goal the way I wanted it to. So with implementing, once I took that Google Doc that you gave me and the first quarter plan that we laid out, and I worked backwards of how does the content of this lead magnet need to support where I'm going. And it worked perfectly. It's really the audio training, which you also helped me to rename it something other than what I was calling it at first. And it makes a difference. So restructuring that, it encompasses my values and my brand message now. Whereas before, it was just kind of a regurgitation of stuff I had already said on the podcast. And I just pulled it all together, kind of reused what I had. I still reused what I had, but in a different format based on my signature system, which you kept telling me, refer to your signature system, use your signature system. So that's what it does. It uses my signature system. And only a small piece. If you want all of it, you got to make an investment.
Well, you're pointing out something that's really important here. It only gives a small piece because honestly, that's all somebody who's that early in the work with you can absorb and action on. I think sometimes we try to deliver, even in podcast content, like even taking a step before the actual, the opt-in, the training, I think sometimes we try to over-deliver and it just sort of pushes them into overwhelm instead of action. And so I love that you talked about starting at the end, working your way back. That's something that when we sat down and we were like, cool, so where do we need them? That's exactly how we talked about it, was working them backwards. It's why when we talk about strategy, we talk about those 3 questions. And that first question is, what are we selling them? Because that's the end result. Like that's where they actually see change. Mm-hmm. Unless you're an incredible implementer like you, Shannon, most people don't see change just from consuming podcast content. And so we've got to start by how do we get them there, right? We put the destination in Google Maps and then we get a route. Mm-hmm. That's how it's got to be. So I love that you worked backwards and I love that you took action on that. As we wrap up, I want you to start talking about some of the wins. We're now in January. You've got some really incredible stuff rolling out. How did our time together impact your ability to start January rolling things out instead of still sort of sitting and deciding what you want to do in January?
It really helped me establish a timeline. We know the importance of working in 90-day increments. We're all used to it as business owners. So having that 90-day plan really helped me expand it to be a 90-day plan that included me with my crazy self launching 3 things at one time. So that was the training, the membership, and relaunching the podcast. But it was easy for me because I had systems in place. So for the podcast itself, all I had to do was create another tab in my Airtable base that I use, or my dashboard, which I created based on one of your podcast episodes in a way that works for me. So then I could track where I was at. Then I broke out the tasks that I needed to complete and I could check them off, including setting up Hello Audio and how that will work and creating the email funnel for that for the training, which we talked about. So as you can see, the training was a key piece of everything because that's where they start. But thanks to that call, I knew how to make it fit so that it would all work together because I knew what I was selling.
I love that. And because, I think a lot of people think the podcast strategy intensive has to be just about your public facing podcast. We actually spent a lot of that intensive talking about the new private podcast and how that was going to look and what that was going to look like. I want to highlight that because it doesn't have to just be your free public facing content. We've got a client who I just wrapped up a strategy call with in November who is going to be looking at another piece of her offering being a premium podcast that's behind a paywall. And so we talked a lot about that on the strategy because a lot of these same processes, a lot of these same frameworks and strategic looks at it are going to be the same way because ideally we move people from her premium content into a larger offer. Even when we're moving people into, it's sort of going to sit as her low dollar offer, right? People who are ready but aren't like all the way ready. They can sit here and get some support. And so I think that that's a really important thing to look at is podcasting can look like lots of different things. It doesn't necessarily always just look like that public facing podcast. I love that. As we wrap up, I want you to share with everyone where they can meet with you, connect with you, hear the podcast, get the new training, because everything is launching. Everything is, it's January. Everything is here.
Mm-hmm. It's live. Everything's live.
Yay! That's so exciting.
So easy place to find me, Instagram, _Shannon Baker. If you click the link in my bio, there is literally a button for everything we've talked about today and more. One-stop shopping. But it's on my website, so it helps you start where I can see where you're coming from.
I love that. I love that. Awesome. We'll also have links to everything in the show notes and in the description. If you open your podcast player, you'll see it there. But I want to thank you, Shannon, for taking some time and talking to us about the intensive. Do you have any final thoughts for somebody who maybe is thinking about it and is not sure it's the right fit for them now?
Well, that's where what I call that black coffee talk comes in with yourself. If you're really invested and committed to moving forward, you have to take action. And if podcasting is not your expertise, you need to make the investment. I say over and over again, it's not that you need continued support like you also offer for podcasters, but invest in the one call that will help you break through the hurdle. So if you're tired of beating your head against the wall like I was, then make the investment because then that breaks down that barrier. And then you can move forward and all the pieces start to come together. So to make movement, you've got to make the investment. It's the only way you can get out of your own way.
I love that. It's so hard. You and I are both strategic brains. You know, this is not a skill set you're lacking. It's just a perspective you're lacking. It's way easier to build strategies of all kinds for other people. What is that old cliche? Like you can't read the label from inside the bottle. Like it's a real thing. I sit down with my team, with my coaches, with consultants occasionally, even about podcast stuff, even about content strategy, because I need someone outside of my brain to be like, we veered off course. Or like, no, that's actually a really good idea, because my brain will go, no, that's a terrible idea. Right? We need that perspective. And so I love that you said that. I want to, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. I want you guys to go check out Shannon's stuff because she's got an incredible podcast. There are links to absolutely everything. And that's it. I'm going to wrap up separately. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that was it. That was my incredible conversation. I am sure you have some takeaways, but I wanted to stop in and I wanted to remind you, if you want to create this same kind of relief, this same kind of line of sight, and this same kind of understanding about where your like public facing and potentially even private facing podcasts fit in and sit together, let's have a conversation. uncommonlymore.com/intensive is the place to go to see available times now. Like I said, we've got these open for January. I think there's some February spots open. March will not be available because production clients have their quarterly calls with us in March. So they will be sitting down with me in March. So if you want to do this in Q1, January, February is the time. Now is the time. I will see you there, and I will see you back here next week to talk about your annual podcast goals and how to set them. See you next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.